The cruelest thing about a game is that sometimes the person who creates it becomes the first one destroyed by it. The ballroom of the Ashford Grand Hotel glowed beneath cascading crystal chandeliers, their golden reflections sliding across marble floors polished so perfectly they mirrored the city lights beyond the towering windows. Manhattan shimmered outside like a kingdom built from diamonds and ambition, but inside the ballroom, more than 500 of the most powerful people in New York stood frozen in complete silence. Billionaires, politicians, investors, fashion icons. Every eye in the room remained fixed on Ethan Callaway. The 36-year-old founder of Callaway Technologies stood alone beneath the white spotlight at the center of the gala stage, his black tuxedo perfectly tailored, his posture controlled with the same cold precision that had made him one of the youngest tech billionaires in America. Usually, Ethan looked untouchable. Tonight, he looked like a man standing in the ruins of his own empire. A faint scar of exhaustion darkened beneath his steel blue eyes, and the champagne glass in his hand remained untouched. Behind him, the giant digital screen still displayed the title of the charity gala in elegant gold letters, Literacy Beyond Borders Annual Fundraiser. But nobody cared about the fundraiser anymore. Not after what Ethan had just confessed. A reporter near the front slowly lowered her microphone, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Callaway, are you saying the rumors are true?" Ethan stared toward the ballroom entrance for a long moment before answering. As though part of him still expected her to walk through those doors. She never did. His jaw tightened almost invisibly. "Yes," he said quietly. The room seemed to stop breathing. Camera flashes exploded like distant lightning. Ethan barely reacted. 1 year ago, he continued, his voice smooth but hollow beneath the chandeliers, "I made a $5 million wager with 3 men sitting in this room tonight." A ripple moved through the crowd. Somewhere near the back, a woman gasped softly. Ethan finally lifted his eyes toward the audience, and for the first time in years, there was no arrogance inside them. Only regret. "The bet was simple," he said. They believed there was one type of woman money couldn't influence anymore. A woman who couldn't be impressed by private jets, luxury dinners, or billionaire charm. His fingers tightened slightly around the crystal glass. "And I told them everyone had a price." Silence. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Brutal. Ethan let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like self-disgust. "Then I met Naomi Brooks." Her name alone changed the atmosphere of the room. Several socialites exchanged glances. A board member near the front shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Everyone in Manhattan knew the story now. The billionaire. The bookstore owner from Brooklyn. The woman who vanished before their engagement announcement. Ethan swallowed slowly before continuing. She owned a small independent bookstore on Lexington Avenue. She wore vintage coats instead of designer labels. Rode the subway instead of black cars. And when I offered her $50,000 to save her business, his voice faltered for half a second. Just enough for people to notice. She looked me in the eye and said, "Some things should never be bought." The ballroom remained utterly still. Outside the windows, snow drifted softly across the Manhattan skyline, covering the city in silver light. Ethan looked down briefly at the diamond engagement ring resting beside the microphone on the podium. The ring he never got the chance to give her. "That should have been the moment I walked away," he admitted quietly. But instead, his expression darkened with shame. "I wanted to win." Somewhere near the stage, someone muttered, "Jesus Christ." Ethan ignored it. "So I created a game." His eyes lifted again, colder now toward himself than anyone else in the room. Luxury trips. Carefully planned encounters. Expensive gifts she never asked for. "I built an entire fantasy designed to make Naomi Brooks fall in love with me." He paused. The silence afterward felt endless. "And the worst part?" Ethan's voice dropped lower. Rougher now. "For a while. I actually believed I was still in control. The chandelier light reflected against the untouched ring as Ethan finally whispered the words that shattered whatever remained of his pride. But somewhere between the lies and the truth, I fell in love with her for real. 1 year earlier, Ethan Calloway believed Manhattan belonged to men like him. Men who built billion-dollar companies before turning 40. Men whose names appeared on magazine covers beside words like visionary, ruthless, and untouchable. From the 72nd floor of Calloway Tower, the city stretched beneath him in rivers of gold and white light, endless traffic threading through midnight streets while snow drifted softly against the glass walls of his office. Ethan stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows with one hand inside the pocket of his charcoal suit, his expression unreadable as 3 of the wealthiest men in New York laughed behind him over aged whiskey and private club arrogance. You are telling me there is actually a woman alive who would say no to Ethan Calloway? Julian Mercer leaned back against the leather sofa with amusement flashing in his pale green eyes. That sounds less believable than aliens. The other men chuckled quietly. Ethan barely reacted. At 36, he had mastered emotional control the same way he mastered hostile acquisitions and billion-dollar negotiations. Calm. Precise. Untouchable. Everyone wants something, Ethan said smoothly. Money. Access. Security. Influence. You just have to figure out the price. Across the room, Damian Sinclair swirled the amber liquid in his crystal glass. That mentality is exactly why your last relationship collapsed. Ethan's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Adrian. Even hearing her name in his mind felt exhausting now. 6 months earlier, his ex-girlfriend had sold private company information to a competitor before leaving him for a European investor twice her age. Since then, Ethan trusted numbers more than people. Numbers did not betray you. Love is leverage, Ethan said coldly. Nothing more. Julian laughed again before placing his whiskey onto the marble table. Fine. Then prove it. Ethan turned slightly. Meaning? Find a woman who does not care about your money, Julian said. No influencers. No models. No socialites from your circles. Just a normal woman. Damian smirked faintly. And make her fall in love with you. Ethan's expression remained calm, though something darker flickered behind his steel blue eyes. That sounds painfully easy. Not this one. Julian reached for his phone before tossing it onto the glass table between them. A photograph filled the screen. A woman stood outside a small bookstore beneath falling snow, adjusting a row of handwritten signs near the entrance. She wore a camel-colored wool coat and dark gloves, her natural curls gathered loosely beneath a knit scarf. Nothing about her looked extravagant. But her smile carried something far more dangerous than beauty. Peace. Ethan picked up the phone silently. Who is she? Naomi Brooks, Julian replied. 29. Columbia graduate. Owns a struggling independent bookstore in Brooklyn. Refused 2 investor buyouts already. Damian leaned forward slightly. One investor offered her $50,000 last month just to turn the place into a luxury coffee brand. Ethan glanced up. And? Julian smiled slowly. She said no. The room fell quiet. Ethan looked back at the photograph. There was something unsettling about the woman's eyes. Warm. Intelligent. Completely unimpressed by the world men like him built around themselves. Why refuse? Ethan asked. Because the bookstore belonged to her grandmother, Julian said. Apparently she told the investor, some things should never be bought. For the first time all evening, Ethan felt something unfamiliar. Curiosity. Outside the windows, snow covered Manhattan in silver light while the city pulsed beneath them like a kingdom fueled by ambition and loneliness. Ethan studied Naomi's photograph for another long moment before setting the phone down carefully. Then he reached for his whiskey at last. "How much?" he asked quietly. Julian's grin widened immediately. $5 million. Damien laughed beneath his breath. "You really think you can do it?" Ethan stared toward the skyline, calm returning to his face like ice settling across dark water. "No," he said softly. "I know I can." 3 nights later, snow melted into cold rain across Brooklyn as Ethan stepped out of the black town car and stared at the narrow bookstore glowing softly between a laundromat and a closed flower shop. Hawthorne Books. The gold-painted letters above the window looked slightly faded beneath the streetlight, and inside, warm amber lamps illuminated rows of crowded wooden shelves that leaned beneath decades of stories. It looked nothing like the polished luxury spaces Ethan normally occupied. No marble. No glass walls. No assistants whispering into wireless headsets. Just warmth. Real warmth. For a moment, he remained standing beneath the rain with one hand in the pocket of his dark overcoat, watching Naomi Brooks through the fogged front window. She sat cross-legged on a ladder beside the history section, reading from an old hardcover while a little girl nearby listened with complete fascination. Naomi's voice carried faintly through the glass whenever customers opened the door. Calm. Gentle. Unhurried. Ethan glanced at his watch automatically. 7:43 in the evening. In Manhattan, his executive board would still be reviewing quarterly projections right now. Here, time itself seemed slower somehow. Human. The little girl laughed suddenly at something Naomi read aloud, and Naomi smiled in return. The expression transformed her entire face. Not performative. Not polished. Real. Ethan found himself staring longer than intended. "You are late." Julian Mercer leaned casually against the town car behind him, holding an umbrella beneath the rain. Ethan barely looked over. "I did not ask you to come." Julian smirked. "I wanted to see the woman who made Ethan Calloway stand in the rain for 10 minutes without moving." Ethan ignored the comment. "Remember the rules," Julian added quietly. "No direct mention of the bet. No manipulation that crosses legal lines. Just charm, luxury, and patience." Ethan's expression hardened slightly. "I know how to handle a conversation." "That is exactly what worries me." Julian's tone softened unexpectedly. "Do not underestimate women like her, Ethan. They see things your world trained you to hide." Ethan said nothing. Across the street, the bookstore door opened as a college-aged employee stepped outside carrying trash bags toward the alley. Warm light spilled briefly onto the wet sidewalk before the door closed again. Ethan straightened his cufflinks almost absently. Calm. Controlled. The same composure that had closed billion-dollar deals in rooms full of older men who once dismissed him as too young to matter. $5 million, Julian reminded quietly. That is a lot of money just to prove a point. Ethan finally looked toward the bookstore entrance again. It is not about the money anymore. Julian raised an eyebrow. You have not even spoken to her yet. Ethan's mouth curved faintly, though there was no humor in it. Exactly. Then he crossed the street alone. A small silver bell chimed softly above the bookstore door as Ethan stepped inside. The warmth hit him immediately, carrying traces of coffee, cedarwood, and old paper. Rainwater darkened the shoulders of his coat while quiet jazz played somewhere near the register. Naomi looked up from behind the ladder. Their eyes met for the first time. Ethan had expected beauty. What unsettled him was the stillness in her gaze. Most people reacted instantly when they recognized him. Surprise. Admiration. Calculation. Naomi showed none of it. Her dark brown eyes moved across his expensive coat, polished shoes, and perfectly tailored appearance before settling calmly back on his face. We are closing in 15 minutes, she said gently. Her voice was smoother than he expected. Low. Intelligent. Ethan stepped farther inside. Then I will make this quick. Naomi closed the hard cover slowly before climbing down the ladder with careful grace. The little girl beside her gathered crayons from the floor while watching Ethan curiously. Can I help you find something? Naomi asked. Ethan glanced around the bookstore deliberately. That depends. On what? Whether this place sells books, he said smoothly, or just protects them from people like me. For the first time, Naomi smiled slightly. Small. Barely there. But enough to shift something unexpectedly inside his chest. That depends, she replied calmly, on whether people like you actually read. The rain outside intensified as customers slowly filtered out of the bookstore one by one, their winter coats carrying traces of snow and city cold into the warm amber light before disappearing back into the Brooklyn night. Ethan remained near the philosophy section with a hardcover novel in his hand that he had not actually opened. Across the room, Naomi moved quietly between shelves, straightening misplaced books with absent precision while soft jazz drifted through the speakers overhead. Nothing about her movements seemed rushed. Even silence felt different around her. Softer somehow. Real. The little girl from earlier finally hugged Naomi tightly before her mother arrived to collect her. Good night, Miss Naomi, the child said sleepily. Naomi smiled and tucked the girl's scarf gently beneath her chin. Good night, Lily. Finish chapter 4 before Friday. I will, the little girl promised before skipping toward the door. Ethan watched Naomi lock the bookstore behind them once the street finally emptied. She turned the sign from open to closed before glancing toward him again. Most people usually leave when they hear we are closing. Ethan leaned lightly against a bookshelf. Most people probably come here knowing what they want. Naomi crossed her arms loosely. And you do not? Not yet. Her eyes narrowed slightly, amused despite herself. You always answer questions like that? Only when I am trying to impress someone. Naomi laughed softly beneath her breath before walking toward the small coffee station near the register. The sound caught Ethan off guard more than it should have. It was warm. Unforced. Coffee, she asked without looking at him. That depends. She glanced back with immediate recognition in her eyes. On whether people like me know how to make it? Ethan smiled faintly for the first time all evening. Something like that. Naomi shook her head with quiet amusement while pouring coffee into two ceramic mugs that clearly did not belong in the same set. One blue. One cream-colored with faded sunflowers painted across the side. Ethan accepted the sunflower mug carefully. Thank you. You are welcome, mysterious man who came into a bookstore during a thunderstorm without buying anything. Ethan looked down at the mug before answering. Ethan. Naomi froze for half a second. Small. Nearly invisible. But enough for him to notice. Of course she recognized the name. Everyone in New York did. Yet unlike most people, she did not suddenly brighten with ambition or curiosity. She simply leaned against the counter quietly. The Ethan Calloway? Unfortunately. Another soft laugh escaped her. That bad? Depends who you ask. Rain tapped steadily against the windows while yellow streetlights shimmered across the wet sidewalks outside. Somewhere deeper in the bookstore, old pipes hummed softly beneath the floorboards. Ethan realized he had not felt this calm in months. No board meetings. No negotiations. No expectations. Just warm coffee and a woman whose attention felt impossible to purchase. Naomi studied him for a moment before speaking again. So why are you really here? Ethan met her eyes over the rim of the coffee mug. For the briefest second, honesty almost happened. Because your smile unsettled me. Because your photograph has been stuck in my mind for 3 straight days. Because I wanted to prove I could win. Instead, he said smoothly, I heard this place might disappear soon. Naomi's expression shifted slightly. The warmth in her eyes dimmed just enough to reveal exhaustion beneath it. Brooklyn rent prices, she said quietly. Developers keep offering to buy the building. But you keep refusing. She looked surprised. You researched me? Ethan remained calm. I research everything before I invest time into it. Naomi held his gaze for several long seconds. There was no flirtation in her expression now. Only intelligence. Careful observation. That sounds lonely, she said softly. The words landed harder than Ethan expected. He looked away first. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the city skyline while reflections from passing headlights slid across the bookstore windows like fading memories. Naomi took another sip of coffee before speaking gently. You know, Mr. Calloway, not everything valuable has to become part of somebody else's empire. Ethan looked back at her slowly. The chandelier glow of Manhattan boardrooms suddenly felt very far away. And what if the empire is the only thing somebody has left? Naomi's expression softened then. Not pity. Something quieter. Something far more dangerous. Understanding. By the following Friday, Ethan Calloway had visited Hawthorne Books 4 times. The pattern unsettled him more than he admitted even to himself. Men like Ethan did not rearrange billion-dollar schedules for small bookstores in Brooklyn. Yet every evening, sometime between board meetings and investor calls, his driver found himself parked beneath the same glowing sign while rain or snow softened the noise of the city outside. Naomi never acted impressed by his presence. That alone became dangerously addictive. On Friday night, she sat cross-legged on the floor beside a stack of donation boxes while jazz music drifted quietly through the bookstore speakers. Her dark curls were tied back loosely with a silk scarf, and reading glasses rested low on her nose as she sorted children's books into separate piles. Ethan stood nearby holding a hardcover copy of To Kill a Mockingbird that he had now carried around for 20 minutes without opening. You know, Naomi said without looking up, most people buy books before using them as decoration. Ethan glanced down at the novel in his hand. I am considering it. That is billionaire language for avoiding commitment. A smile touched his mouth despite himself. You always talk to customers like this? Only the strange ones. She finally looked up then, warm amusement flickering in her eyes beneath the soft bookstore lights. Ethan realized something uncomfortable in that moment. He was beginning to wait for her smiles. Outside, Brooklyn moved through another freezing February evening. Taxi lights blurred through wet streets while pedestrians hurried beneath umbrellas and scarves. But inside Hawthorne Books, time seemed suspended beneath old wood shelves and amber lamps. Ethan loosened his tie slightly as he watched Naomi tape another donation box shut. What are those for? Community Center in Queens, she answered. They lost part of their library funding last month. Ethan frowned faintly. And you are donating inventory you already cannot afford to lose? Naomi shrugged lightly. Kids still deserve stories. Simple answer. No performance attached to it. Ethan looked at the boxes again. There were at least 30. Hundreds of books. Thousands of dollars in inventory. That is not a good business strategy. Naomi smiled softly. Good thing I opened a bookstore for love instead of profit. The words stayed with him longer than they should have. Ethan crossed slowly toward the front windows where snow had begun drifting heavily across the sidewalk again. Somewhere behind him, Naomi hummed quietly to the jazz music while organizing another stack of paperbacks. The sound felt strangely domestic. Peaceful in a way his penthouse never was. His phone buzzed sharply against the marble counter, shattering the warmth of the moment. Julian, update? Ethan stared at the message without replying. A second text appeared almost immediately. Julian, do not tell me you are actually reading books now. Ethan slipped the phone face down onto the counter. Everything okay? Naomi asked gently. Business. You say that word like it tastes bitter. Ethan looked over at her. Most days it does not. And tonight? Snowflakes drifted against the windows behind him like soft white ash. Ethan studied Naomi carefully before answering. Tonight I cannot tell. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. Dangerous, maybe. But not uncomfortable. Naomi stood and brushed dust lightly from her jeans before reaching for her coat hanging near the register. Come on. Ethan blinked once. Where are we going? You have the expression of a man who has not walked outside without security in at least 10 years. 8, Ethan corrected automatically. Naomi laughed quietly. That is honestly worse. 10 minutes later, Ethan found himself walking beside her through snow-covered Brooklyn streets carrying 2 paper cups of hot chocolate from a corner cafe that looked older than he was. No cameras followed them. No assistants hovered nearby. Just cold winter air and the distant sound of traffic softened beneath snowfall. Naomi pointed toward a mural painted across the side of an apartment building. My grandmother helped fund that after the neighborhood blackout in 2011. Ethan studied the mural beneath flickering streetlights. Children reading beneath painted stars. Bright colors against old brick. Your grandmother sounds extraordinary. Naomi's expression softened immediately. She was. Ethan noticed the shift in her voice. The quiet ache hidden beneath it. Was. Naomi looked down at the steaming cup in her gloved hands. Cancer, she said softly. 3 years ago. Ethan felt something tighten unexpectedly inside his chest. Naomi gave him a small smile then. Brave. Controlled. She left me the bookstore. Snow gathered lightly along her curls while city lights reflected gold against the wet pavement around them. Ethan looked at her for a long moment before speaking quietly. Then I think she left the city something too. Naomi stopped walking after that. Just for a second. Her eyes lifted slowly toward him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. And somewhere deep beneath the layers of calculation and ego Ethan Calloway had spent years building around himself, the game began slipping from his control. By early March, Ethan no longer needed excuses to see Naomi. The meetings that had once been carefully calculated now blurred into something dangerously genuine. Tuesday coffee deliveries turned into long conversations beside bookstore shelves after closing hours. Friday dinners became Sunday morning walks through Brooklyn flea markets where Naomi laughed at his inability to negotiate prices with street vendors. Somewhere along the way, Ethan stopped reporting updates to Julian entirely. That should have warned him how deep he was falling. On a cold Thursday evening, Manhattan glittered beneath storm clouds while Ethan sat through a charity auction at the Astoria Crown Hotel surrounded by people who had spent years admiring his ambition and fearing his indifference. Crystal chandeliers shimmered across champagne towers while cameras flashed against polished marble walls. Women in couture gowns drifted through the ballroom beside men discussing stock prices and political donations in voices smooth as old whiskey. Usually, Ethan moved through rooms like this effortlessly. Tonight, he checked his watch every 12 minutes. Julian noticed immediately. You are distracted, he murmured quietly beside him near the auction stage. Ethan adjusted the cuff of his black tuxedo without looking over. I have a meeting later. Julian smirked faintly. At the bookstore? Ethan remained silent. That answer alone was enough. Across the ballroom, investors laughed too loudly beneath golden lights while a string quartet played softly near the center fountain. Julian studied Ethan carefully before lowering his voice. You were supposed to charm her, Ethan. Not look at your phone every 30 seconds like a teenager in love. Ethan's jaw tightened. I know exactly what I am doing. But even he no longer believed that completely. His phone buzzed softly in his pocket. A message from Naomi. Naomi, The bakery downstairs burned the cinnamon rolls again. Brooklyn may never recover. Ethan stared at the text longer than necessary before a faint smile touched his mouth. Small. Real. Julian saw it immediately. Oh no, he muttered beneath his breath. Ethan looked up sharply. What? Julian leaned back against the marble column beside him with growing concern in his eyes. That smile. What about it? You never used to do that. Before Ethan could answer, another investor approached them carrying 2 champagne glasses. Calloway, the older man, greeted warmly. We still on for St. Bart's next month? Ethan barely hesitated. Cancel it. The investor blinked. You have not missed that trip in 7 years. Ethan's expression remained calm. Things change. The man eventually drifted away looking confused while Julian stared openly now. You cancelled St. Bart's? Ethan reached for his whiskey. It was getting repetitive. No, Julian replied quietly. You are changing. Ethan looked toward the ballroom windows where rain streaked against the glass high above Manhattan. Changing. The word unsettled him more than it should have. Because Julian was right. Somewhere between late-night coffee at Hawthorne Books and snow-covered walks through Brooklyn, Ethan had started becoming someone he barely recognized. He slept better now. Laughed more. Even his assistants noticed he no longer barked orders during meetings. Last week he approved employee maternity leave expansions without negotiation. Yesterday he donated anonymously to 3 public school libraries in Brooklyn after Naomi casually mentioned budget cuts. None of it felt strategic anymore. It simply felt right. That terrified him. You need to end this before it gets worse, Julian warned quietly. Ethan looked over slowly. Worse? You are forgetting how this started. Silence settled heavily between them. Across the ballroom, photographers clustered near the staircase as another celebrity entered beneath camera flashes. Ethan suddenly felt exhausted by all of it. The performance. The image. The endless luxury that once made him feel powerful but now only felt empty. What if I do not care how it started anymore? Ethan asked quietly. Julian's expression changed instantly. Concern replaced amusement completely now. Ethan, I mean it. His voice lowered further. What if she is the only honest thing I have touched in years? Julian looked away briefly toward the ballroom crowd before speaking carefully. Then tell her the truth now. Ethan's chest tightened immediately. Naomi's face flashed through his mind beneath bookstore lights. Her quiet laughter. Her trust. The way she looked at him like he was more than headlines and billion-dollar valuations. The thought of watching that look disappear made something inside him go cold. I cannot, Ethan admitted softly. Julian studied him for several long seconds before asking the question Ethan had avoided asking himself for weeks. Are you still trying to win the bet? Ethan looked down at the untouched whiskey glass in his hand. Then, almost painfully, he answered. No rain hammered harder against the ballroom windows while Manhattan glowed beneath storm clouds and chandelier light. Somewhere across the river, Naomi Brooks was probably locking up her bookstore beneath warm amber lamps, completely unaware that the man she was beginning to trust had already fallen hopelessly in love with her. Spring arrived slowly in New York, softening the edges of winter with warmer rain and longer evenings, but Ethan Calloway felt more unsettled than he had during the coldest months of the year. Because by April, Naomi Brooks no longer felt like part of a wager. She felt like home. The realization terrified him. On Sunday evening, Hawthorne Books closed early for a neighborhood literacy fundraiser hosted inside a renovated community hall 3 blocks away. Folding chairs lined the old wooden floors while strings of warm lights hung from exposed ceiling beams, casting golden reflections across crowded tables filled with donated novels and homemade desserts. Children ran between shelves carrying paper stars they had painted themselves while jazz music drifted softly from an old speaker near the stage. Naomi moved through the room greeting families by name, her deep emerald dress flowing gently around her as she laughed beside volunteers and helped nervous children practice reading aloud into microphones. Ethan stood near the back wall watching her quietly. He had attended charity galas worth millions of dollars inside Manhattan ballrooms lined with crystal chandeliers and famous last names, yet none of them had ever felt as alive as this small room in Brooklyn. Naomi finally noticed him standing there and smiled immediately. Real warmth filled her face in a way that still made Ethan's chest tighten unexpectedly every single time. "You actually came," she said as she crossed toward him carrying 2 paper cups of lemonade. Ethan accepted one carefully. "You sounded surprised. You canceled a board dinner for this. How do you know that?" Naomi gave him a look over the rim of her cup. "You wear your expensive stress differently when you skip work." Ethan laughed softly beneath his breath. The sound still felt unfamiliar coming from him. Naomi tilted her head slightly. "There it is again." "What?" "That laugh." Her smile deepened faintly. "You only do it when you forget to be intimidating." Ethan looked at her for a long moment after that. The noise of the fundraiser blurred softly around them while children's laughter echoed beneath warm lights overhead. He wanted to tell her everything then. The bet. The lies. The way she had changed him without even trying. But fear held him still. Fear of watching her eyes turn cold. Fear of losing the only thing in his life that no longer felt empty. Across the room, a volunteer hurried toward Naomi carrying a cardboard box overflowing with children's books. "Naomi, we need more copies near the stage." "Coming." She glanced back toward Ethan. "Do not disappear." He watched her walk away through the crowd with graceful confidence, stopping every few feet to greet another family or comfort another nervous child. Nobody in the room cared that Ethan Calloway was worth billions of dollars. Nobody treated him like a celebrity or a weapon or a business opportunity. For the first time in years, he simply existed beside people who cared about something other than power. The realization settled heavily in his chest. Ethan slipped his hands into the pockets of his dark blazer and turned slightly toward the stage where a shy little boy struggled to read into the microphone while his classmates encouraged him softly from the front row. Naomi knelt beside the boy patiently, helping him sound out difficult words one line at a time without rushing him once. Ethan felt something painful move through him then. Not guilt exactly. Something deeper. Grief for the version of himself that once believed money was the answer to everything. His phone vibrated sharply against his pocket. "Julian, call me immediately." Ethan frowned before stepping toward the quieter hallway outside the community room. The moment he answered, Julian's voice came through tense and urgent. "Where are you?" "Brooklyn." "Leave. Right now." Ethan straightened immediately. "What happened?" Silence crackled briefly across the line before Julian finally answered. "Damien got drunk at a private poker dinner tonight." Ethan's stomach dropped instantly. "Julian, someone recorded him talking about the wager." The hallway suddenly felt too small. Too warm. Inside the fundraiser room behind him, Naomi's soft laughter drifted faintly through the doorway while children applauded another successful reading at the microphone. Ethan closed his eyes slowly. "Who heard it?" "I do not know yet." Julian's voice lowered carefully. "But if that recording reaches Naomi before you tell her yourself," he did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Ethan looked through the doorway toward Naomi standing beneath golden lights surrounded by children and books and warmth he did not deserve. For the first time in years, Ethan Calloway felt genuine fear. The following morning, Manhattan woke beneath gray skies and cold spring rain, but Ethan Calloway had not slept at all. His penthouse remained silent except for the distant hum of traffic 70 floors below and the untouched espresso cooling beside his office window. The city looked blurred through rain-covered glass, silver and restless beneath heavy clouds. Ethan stood motionless in front of the skyline wearing the same black sweater from the night before, his phone clenched tightly in one hand while Julian's final warning repeated endlessly inside his mind. Tell her before someone else does. But fear had already rooted itself too deeply inside him. Fear of seeing disappointment replace warmth in Naomi's eyes. Fear of becoming exactly the kind of man she believed he was not. A soft knock interrupted the silence. His assistant entered carefully holding a tablet against her chest. "Sir, there is a situation online." Ethan already knew. The moment she turned the screen toward him, his stomach dropped. A blurry video clip from the poker dinner had exploded across social media overnight. The audio quality was rough beneath the noise of glasses and laughter, but Damien Sinclair's voice remained unmistakably clear. 5 million says Ethan can make the bookstore girl fall in love before summer. Ethan closed his eyes slowly. Beneath the headline, thousands of comments poured across the screen every minute. Some mocking. Some furious. Some disgusted. His assistant hesitated carefully. "The communications team is preparing a statement." Ethan's voice came out cold and hollow. "No statements." "Sir, investors are already calling." "I said no statements." She quietly left after that. Ethan remained staring at the rain-soaked skyline for several seconds before grabbing his coat and car keys without another word. Across Brooklyn, Hawthorne Books looked different somehow beneath the storm clouds. Quieter. Smaller. Fragile in a way Ethan had never noticed before. Rain tapped steadily against the bookstore windows as he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The familiar bell chimed softly overhead. Naomi stood behind the register organizing receipts beside a half-finished cup of coffee. For one brief second, relief crossed Ethan's face simply because she was there. Then he saw her expression. Calm. Controlled. Too calm. The warmth that once lived in her eyes had vanished completely. Ethan stopped moving. "Naomi," she slowly closed the receipt folder in front of her before finally looking up at him. "How long?" Her voice was quiet. Not angry. Somehow that hurt worse. Ethan swallowed hard. "Naomi, let me explain." "No," she shook her head once. "Answer the question first." Rain streaked slowly down the windows behind her while soft jazz still played faintly through the bookstore speakers like the ghost of a happier version of this place. Ethan looked at her and realized there was no strategy left now. No charm. No carefully controlled conversation. Only truth. From the beginning, he admitted quietly. Naomi looked down briefly after hearing that. Not dramatic. Not shattered. Just disappointed in a way that made Ethan feel smaller than he ever had in his life. $5 million, she said softly, almost to herself. That was the price? No, Ethan stepped closer immediately. It stopped being about the money a long time ago. Naomi laughed once beneath her breath, but there was no humor inside it. You know what the worst part is? Her eyes lifted toward him again, and Ethan felt his chest tighten painfully at the hurt hidden behind her calm composure. I knew something felt wrong almost from the beginning. Ethan froze. Naomi wrapped both hands slowly around the coffee cup as if grounding herself against the weight of the moment. Men like you do not walk into small bookstores by accident. Her voice remained steady. The expensive watch. The rehearsed conversations. The way you always seem to know things you should not know. Ethan stared at her silently. So why did you keep seeing me? He asked quietly. Naomi's expression finally cracked then. Just slightly. Enough for pain to show through. Because somewhere along the way, she whispered, you stopped sounding fake. The words hit harder than anger ever could have. Rain hammered against the windows while silence spread heavily between them. Ethan stepped forward carefully. "Naomi, I love you." She closed her eyes briefly after hearing that. Not because she did not believe him. That was the tragedy. She did. When Naomi finally looked at him again, tears shimmered faintly in her eyes but never fell. "That is what makes this so cruel," she said softly. Then she reached beneath the counter and slid a small velvet box across the wood toward him. Ethan stared down at the unopened engagement ring he had hidden inside his office drawer weeks ago. His blood went cold instantly. Naomi's voice broke slightly for the first time. "You were planning to propose." Ethan could barely breathe now. "Naomi, I think," she interrupted gently, "you should go." 6 months later, the first snow of December drifted softly across Chicago while Ethan Calloway stood alone outside a renovated brick building on the corner of West Monroe Street with his hands buried deep inside the pockets of a dark wool coat. The sign above the entrance glowed warmly beneath golden lights. Brooks Literacy Foundation. Children's laughter echoed faintly through the windows while snow collected along the sidewalk in silver layers around him. Ethan stared at the building quietly for a long moment before stepping inside. The warmth hit him immediately. Bright murals covered the walls now. Shelves lined with thousands of donated books stretched across the open reading hall while volunteers helped children decorate paper snowflakes near a fireplace in the corner. The entire place felt alive. Hopeful. Everything Hawthorne books once represented had somehow grown into something even bigger. More beautiful. Ethan moved slowly through the center hallway, his expression calm but tired in ways 6 months earlier would have seemed impossible for a man like him. The scandal had destroyed more than headlines. Investors withdrew from Callaway Technologies within weeks. Board members forced Ethan to step down temporarily while reporters turned his private humiliation into entertainment for millions of strangers online. But none of it hurt the way losing Naomi had. Because every empty penthouse room still reminded him of laughter that no longer existed there. Every boardroom reflected the version of himself he no longer wanted to be. "I was wondering how long it would take you." Ethan turned at the sound of her voice. Naomi stood near the library staircase beneath warm chandelier light wearing a cream-colored sweater and dark slacks, her curls falling softly around her shoulders while snow melted against the sleeves of her coat. She looked stronger somehow. Peaceful in a way that made Ethan realize how much pain he had once brought into her life. For several seconds, neither moved. The silence between them carried the weight of everything unsaid during the past 6 months. Ethan finally spoke first. "This place is incredible." Naomi glanced around the literacy center quietly. "The community built most of it. You built the rest." Her eyes returned to him slowly. There was no anger left inside them now. But trust did not live there either. Not yet. Ethan nodded once before reaching inside his coat pocket carefully. Naomi's expression shifted slightly when he placed a white envelope onto the nearby wooden table between them. "What is that?" "The $5 million. Snow continued falling outside the tall windows while children laughed somewhere deeper inside the building. Naomi stared down at the envelope silently without touching it. Ethan's voice remained low. "Honest. I never collected it." Naomi looked up at him again. "Why are you giving it to me?" Ethan swallowed slowly before answering. "Because this foundation matters more than my pride." He paused briefly. "And because I spent most of my life believing money could repair damage after it was done." Naomi studied him carefully then. The expensive arrogance that once defined Ethan Calloway had disappeared almost completely now. What remained looked quieter. Human. "You disappeared from New York," she said softly. Ethan nodded faintly. "I needed to become someone I could live with first." Silence settled gently between them again while snowfall covered Chicago in soft white light beyond the windows. Finally, Naomi looked down at the envelope one last time before slowly pushing it back toward him across the table. Ethan frowned slightly. "Naomi, keep it." Her voice was calm but firm. Ethan stared at her, confused. Naomi stepped closer then, close enough for him to see the emotion carefully restrained behind her